Sunrise on the Reaping is finally here, and I have a lot of thoughts. In this video, I'm going to be doing an in-depth review and breakdown of this novel, going through my thoughts, my likes, my dislikes, and diving into some of the more complicated bits of writing that we saw in this novel. If you enjoy this video, please consider liking and sharing. It will greatly help to grow and sustain the channel. And if you like what you see, hit that subscribe button, and you can also follow me on all of my other social medias, all of which are linked down below, and all of which house similar content that I make here on this channel. Now, let's get into the review. Plain and simple, this book was really good. Catching Fire will always be my favorite book in the series, closely followed by the first Hunger Games book. But I would say that this novel is up there with Mockingjay and above the other prequel, Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. Compared to Sunrise on the Reaping, Ballad felt very rushed at times, but I think the pacing for Sunrise was well crafted. There were times where I actually felt it went a bit too slow, but for the most part, the tempo felt much more natural than it did in Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I think the development of Haymitch's character was the strongest part of this book. We had obviously known the basics. He won the 50th Hunger Games by using the force field, the games had twice as many tributes as normal, he had an alliance with Maisily Donner, and his mother, brother, and girl were killed by Snow. You can tell that Suzanne Collins wanted to expand on all of those things, which she definitely did, but it's clear that her main focus was creating new elements around those plot points. At times I felt she was sort of dancing around the original plot, as if it was an inconvenience to the new narrative she wanted to tell. The new narrative was by far my favorite part of the book though. Building these new ideas around Haymitch with Luella, his arc with Maisily, and developing how tragic of a character he is were all executed masterfully. This story really delves into why Haymitch is the way he is in the original trilogy. Collins took the loss that we already knew he suffered and amplified it. We now see that he feels responsible for not only his mother, brother, and girl's death, but also for Wyris losing her mind because of him rebelling, not to mention letting down all of those he made an alliance with the Nettie newcomers. Losing all of them would foreshadow the life he would live for the next 25 years, not being able to help all the tributes he mentored year after year and was forced to watch them die in the arena. Then revealing the fact that every reaping day is his birthday only adds to the fact. It makes you rethink the day Katniss and Peeta were reaped when he made a fool of himself drunk as can be and why he had no motivation to help them win. Haymitch's relationship with alcohol was composed really well in this novel. We discover that he was around alcohol for years, actually making and distributing it to all of those in District 12, but he never drank himself. Even when gifted a bottle on his birthday, he immediately decides that he's not going to drink it, instead deciding to trade it or give it to his girl's uncle. Even when he was in front of the finest alcohol he'd ever seen while in Plutarch's home, he still decides not to drink. It's not until President Snow's involvement that he turns Haymitch onto the numbing feeling that drugs and alcohol can give you. It starts when a device is put on his chest, pumping drugs consistently through his body, which he quickly realizes he is very addicted to when they take the device off. And Snow only adds to this when he takes everyone that Snow loves away from him, making him turn to the bottle simply to forget and cope. It seems to always come back to President Snow, no matter who you're talking about in the series. Haymitch's relationship with Luella was one of the strongest parts of the novel for me. Collins sort of gave Haymitch his own version of Rue, but made it even more haunting. Not only did he have to watch her die, but he had to see her come back in this horrible form. It put Haymitch in a tough position because he is disgusted by this girl in Luella's body, but later he feels a great deal of sympathy for whoever was in that body. It shows what kind of person Haymitch really is. Even when Snow gives him the worst scenario, he doesn't let it fully break him down. As I said, the character Luella is Haymitch's version of Rue, but on top of that, her arc also bears a close resemblance to the hijacked Peeta. President Snow took a person that both Haymitch and Katniss loved and made them a totally different person. I think Haymitch comes out looking better though, because he never abandons this girl, while Katniss at one point completely gave up on Peeta. And uncoincidentally, who was the person that made her see sense? Haymitch. He had to tell her to be more sensitive, making her think about how Peeta would be treating her if the roles were reversed. I think Suzanne Collins had fun drawing similarities between Haymitch and Katniss. Going past what we just mentioned, both lost their fathers, both were not originally reaped for the games, Both left behind a struggling mother and a younger sibling, and both even had an identical scene of looking up and defying Snow at the end of the tribute parade. Because of this, both Haymitch and Katniss were handed an ultimatum from the president, telling them to convince the audience of something, whether it be selling a love story or becoming a rascal rather than a rebel. Otherwise, he would kill all of those closest to them. Snow also had something he used to mess with them. For Katniss, it was roses, which he placed in her house following the bombing at 12, and also dropped above District 13. Meanwhile, Snow used milk and bread to mess with Haymitch, all stemming from Haymitch defiantly drinking the milk Snow needed following his poisoning. Snow deviously sent those very things to Haymitch while he was in the arena, and Haymitch knew it was most likely poisoned. And whether it was or wasn't, this was Snow's way of getting back at Haymitch for drinking the milk he needed earlier. Snow also took this a step farther, giving nothing but bread and milk to Haymitch while he was locked up following his victory. And he also provided it to him on his train ride home from 12, which was just a taste of what Snow had waiting for him when he arrived at home. The biggest similarity between Katniss and Haymitch that's painted in this book, though, is Plutarch coming to them and offering them the opportunity to be the face of the rebellion. Plutarch saw a spark in both of them and realized that they could influence those suffering in the districts and also sway the capital citizens' perception of what they were raised to believe. Arguably, or maybe not arguably, Haymitch had a much tougher road to get here, as Snow actually followed through on his threat and killed those he loved, which he did not do to Katniss. Katniss had not suffered as much when Plutarch approached her with the same offer, which probably played a role in why she agreed while Haymitch did not. Haymitch is now a picture of what Katniss could have been. As Haymitch said in Mockingjay, Snow used him as an example to keep all of the other victors like Finnick, Joanna, and Kashmir in line. Katniss also had something that Haymitch did not when agreeing to be the face of the rebellion, that being Haymitch himself. Though he refused Plutarch's offer, he still had a hand in forming the Mockingjay. There were many other references to the original series. The re-emergence of Plutarch was one that I think genuinely helped the narrative, but the way in which Suzanne Collins incorporated him felt a bit forced. While Plutarch was a good character to add, I feel like it was weird because we had never heard of somebody being assigned to film a specific district throughout the games, and even if this was something that happened, I felt it was unrealistic that 12, the most dismissed district when it came to the games, got this assignment over all of the other districts. Overall, Plutarch's role in the story was a key element of what made the narrative work, but I just wish she introduced him in a different way. B.D. Ladier is another example of someone who did have an authentic need for the story, especially when you see his efforts pay off in the original trilogy, finishing what he had started here in Sunrise on the Reaping. He couldn't blow up the arena in the 50th Hunger Games, but he succeeded to do so 25 years later in the 75th Games. The inclusion of Mags and Wyrus was another example of past characters returning that I can get behind. They complemented each other nicely as mentors, Mags focusing on emotional support, while Wyrus gave more practical support. I love the saying she made that was the key to surviving. First, avoid the slaughter, get weapons, look for water, find food and where to sleep, fire and friends can keep. It was also a lot of fun to learn about a whole new Hunger Games and how Wyrus became a victor. It was also interesting to see Wyrus both before and after her brain was cracked, and the fact that this was the doing of Snow also adds to the viciousness of his character. Effie Trinket is a character that was 100% fan service. There was no need for her to be there whatsoever, and I was actually disappointed when she did show up, mainly because I was enjoying seeing the comparison of how Drusilla did the job compared to Effie years later. But then when Effie showed up, she just took the job over, and it completely ruined that part of the story that I found to be very intriguing. I wanted to see more of Drusilla. Another thing that I disliked was saying that Haymitch sat in the plant Katniss, which made me kind of annoyed because there was no reason to incorporate that. We had just had a very emotional and heart-stopping scene where a capital Mutt killed Haymitch and Macelee's allies. Saying he sat in Katniss right after immediately ruined any emotion I had for the scene before it. And it's a shame because the sequence before it was really well written and really well composed. It's one thing if it has a deeper meaning or a purpose to the story, but it had nothing to do with anything. Comparing this to the use of the Katniss plan in her last prequel novel, Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, it's night and day. The appearance of the Katniss plan in Ballad actually had a lot of meaning to it. It was what tied Lucy Gray and Katniss Everdeen to each other in Snow's head, greatly enhancing any scene he and Katniss were a part of in the original series. And there was another line that made me roll my eyes. I'm referring to when Hattie, Haymitch's boss, said, "Fire is catching." This was a line that Katniss said in a moment of great emotion. Adding this line to this book in such a meaningless moment sort of takes away the importance it had when Katniss said it. To me, that should have been Katniss's line and hers alone, because it was the phrase that truly ignited the Mockingjay. I honestly found the constant fan service disappointing. It makes me wonder if knowing that this novel will be turned into a movie in a little over a year affected how Collins wrote it. That was one of my main concerns for Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes when it was announced, but I was very pleased that that was not the case in that prequel novel. So to see it here, I was genuinely shocked. Another complaint I have is that there were times where I got a bit frustrated while reading this book, especially toward the end. Because I knew what was going to happen, I was like, okay, come on, just get there. This was especially true with the games and Maiseli's death. I think the games were dragged out far too long and could have been a lot shorter. Because we already knew so much about these games, I had expected, or at least hoped, that most of the novel would take place outside of the arena, either before or after. And I think this is one of the book's biggest flaws, and it was a flaw from the moment they conceived the idea, and that is focusing on this time period. We had so much information on the story already that it felt dull at times and actually took much of the suspense away. We knew that Willamette, Sid, and Lenore were going to die from the start, and we knew how the majority of the games would go, including the ending. Collins of course added a bit to the end, having Haymitch try to blow up the arena, but even with that, it was just too familiar to build the suspense, at least in my opinion. One of the great things about our last prequel was that we had no idea what was going to happen or how things were going to play out, which I think made that climax so much more suspenseful than Sunrise on the Reapings. Had I not known the outcome, I think his family dying in the fire as well as Lenore Dove's poisoning would have pulled on those same emotional strings that Ballad did, but I knew it was coming long before it was spelled out for us. I knew right away that the gumdrops were poison from the second they were introduced, and I knew that as soon as he got off the train, Sid and Willamette's deaths were coming. While I disliked the fire is catching line, there was actually a line that I did enjoy hearing, and that was "Snow lands on top." It was the final line of the last prequel that focused on Coriolanus Snow, and it's only right that Snow should continue to use it, this time saying it to Haymitch, because it is what motivates his ruthlessness. And having Haymitch say it back to him later on when it's clear that President Snow had already won was very fitting, because even when Haymitch loses, he still has a rebellious streak. A rebellious streak though that Snow would diminish with his next line, "Enjoy your homecoming." The homecoming he was referring to knocked the rebel right out of Haymitch when he lost everyone he loved. Lenore Dove was a great addition to Haymitch's character. This was an example of something Collins took from her previous work and magnificently created into something that was a highlight of the book for me. One of my favorite moments in this book included Lenore, and that is when Haymitch looked out the window of the train as it took him to the capital and saw Lenore standing on the hill holding the gumdrops he had instructed Sid to give her. It allowed them to give one final goodbye, and it was an amazing moment. Fascinatingly, Lenore Dove represents what Snow lost. A girl from the covey who you fall in love with. Both he and Haymitch have this in common, and both of their love stories ended tragically. Following both Lenore Dove and Lucy Gray's deaths, neither Snow nor Haymitch ever loved again, but for opposite reasons. Snow realized that love was his weakness, and he refused to ever let it distract him again. Meanwhile, Haymitch's love for Lenore was his strength. He never loved again because he had mated for life, just like the geese both he and Lenore raised. While Haymitch fulfilled his promise to his love, never letting the sun rise on the reaping again, Coriolanus broke every promise he had ever made to his love. The meaning of Lenore Dove's name was another thing that intrigued me. We're told that Dove means gray, which expands on a tradition of the covey based on how they name their children after colors. Snow trying to guess Lenore's name was a curious moment, as he guessed everything except for the one that was staring him right in the face. The name that he had tried so hard to forget comes back to him: Gray. The color gray also popped up time and time again for Haymitch throughout this novel. Whether it was their gray training suits, their gray overalls for the parade, and most of all, the gray rabbit that helps him throughout his time in the arena, giving Haymitch a reminder of the strength that Lenore Dove gives him. Snow also used this rabbit to foreshadow what Haymitch's future held. The rabbit was executed right in front of him, just as Lenore would die in his arms. Seeing District 12's past finally be expanded on was an enjoyable part of this book. Discovering that one of Haymitch's best friends, Burdock, was Katniss's father seemed very fitting and very believable. And on top of that, fleshing out the merchant section with Katniss and Prim's mother Astrid, as well as the Donner twins, really added to District 12 both in this time and in the future, especially with how they link the mayor and Madge Undersea. I was excited to see this because I felt as though the district was not fully fleshed out during Katniss's time. Hell, we didn't even know what Mr. and Mrs. Everdene's names were until this book. So I'm glad that Suzanne Collins took the time to give us more knowledge on this community that we sort of knew, but now we know so much better. Tam Amber was another character that returned, not from the original trilogy though, but from the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. He turns out to be one of the few gay characters we've seen in Panem, and he and his partner raised Lenore Dove. While he's from Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, we see here that he also plays a very large role in the original series as well. We discover that he was the one who crafted the Mockingjay pin, Katniss's token that she took into the arena. Drawing yet another comparison between Haymitch and Katniss, both end up having a token in the games, Haymitch having something similar to Katniss's token with the striker that Lenore Dove gave him, which he's actually able to use in the arena, exploiting it to create fires. This situation also bears a close resemblance to Coriolanus Snow giving Lucy Gray her token, which technically wasn't a token, but a compact full of poison that they snuck in. But either way, both of their loves gave them something that they could exploit during the games. Mesa Lee Donner was absolutely a standout character in this novel. The way both Haymitch and we the audience come to respect her, it was earned character growth. As Haymitch said, she was a person he loathed, then grudgingly respected, and then loved like a sister. It plays on the old trope of don't judge a book by its cover. She might have been pampered and come from wealth, but right away we see that that did not define her. In fact, it was quite the opposite. She never expected anything, and never even brought up the advantage she might have expected based on the way she was raised. Her relationship with Haymitch was something that was also earned. It didn't just pop out of nowhere. Collins took the time to develop it in a very believable and heartwarming way. Mesa Lee takes on the thing that Haymitch had lost, a sister. He had never been able to experience having a sister after the twin girls whom he thought he would be a brother to died in labor. This made the discussion where they basically establish what they are to each other, brother and sister, set up a really touching and well-deserved ending, as Haymitch notes that Mesa Lee died with family beside her. Staying true to what the series is about, death, we had some pretty brutal displays of violence, which naturally showed the brutality that these books are comprised of. Right off the bat, we see Woodbine, the boy chosen from the Reaping, try to run and have his head explode. Then we also have little Ampert's death, who was eaten alive by mutation squirrels that ate every last piece of him, leaving only his skeleton on the ground. Those mutations were programmed specifically to eat Ampert and Ampert alone, which was punishment for both Haymitch and Beetee. And the same thing was the case with Mesa Lee's death, as we find out that the candy pink birds, which we knew from the start would be her cause of death, were also programmed to only kill her, one puncturing her right in the throat. Snow making this happen to both Ampert and Mesa Lee makes Haymitch think that it's his fault they died. It makes it clear why he was the way he was in that first book. Like in Mockingjay, propaganda played a large role in Sunrise on the Reaping. Plutarch tried his best to influence Panem's view of District 12, but while he won up the Capitol in the original trilogy, the Capitol won out with their propaganda scheme here. They were able to change the 50th Hunger Games as well as Haymitch's part in them to fit the narrative that they wanted. And this also led to what Katniss and Peeta saw when watching the 50th Hunger Games highlights and Catching Fire. The Capitol's influence during this time was an interesting plotline. They brand themselves as what the districts need in a very condescending way. If you look at their slogan, it says, "No peace, no bread. No peace, no security. No peacekeepers, no peace. No capital, no peace." It starts out with a threat saying that if you don't fall in line, they don't get food. But then by the end of the slogan, it paints themselves as their saviors who will protect them from upheaval. This is greatly contrasted by Haymitch coming to the realization that the arena is a machine, just like the capital is a machine. It's all a facade to look pretty and perfect, when really, deep below both the arena and the capital itself lies a way to break them. In Sunrise on the Reaping, they fail to destroy these machines, that being both the arena and the capital. But 25 years later, they succeed in destroying both, Katniss blowing up the arena in the 75th games, and the rebellion taking down the capital once and for all. One thing that I have to mention is the inclusion of Edgar Allan Poe's poem The Raven, which became Lenore Dove's name song. I have not looked at any reactions or any reviews on this book because I wanted to make this video first so it would have my own opinions and my own opinions alone. But some things slipped through, and I did hear that a lot of people did not like the use of the Raven. To me though, I think it was a brilliant move by Suzanne Collins, and only makes Haymitch's story even more tragic. The narrator of the poem is mourning the death of his love, his lost Lenore. The narrator then struggles between two desires, the temptation to forget Lenore and the desperation to remember her. Haymitch of course slowly gravitates toward forgetting her, using drugs and alcohol to do so. However, as the poem says, he gets a late night visitor, that being the Raven, who only repeats the word nevermore, insisting upon remembering. The way that I interpret it is that this is Haymitch's subconscious reminding him of the promise he made to Lenore Dove, to stop the sunrise on the reaping, thus where the book got its namesake. Then, not knowing which path to take, forgetting or remembering, the narrator of the poem, as well as Haymitch, accept the only conclusion, and that is to lean into the madness that awaits him. It's quite brilliant of Suzanne Collins in my opinion. I was surprised that so many people disliked this. I don't know, maybe they didn't fully understand it, or maybe they just skimmed over the parts, kind of like they did when they skimmed over the songs in Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. But hopefully I've shed some light on why that piece of writing should be admired. The epilogue was equally as fantastic as the final chapter, but for much different reasons. Having it tie back to the original trilogy is what I had hoped for, so it would bring Haymitch's story full circle. The inclusion of Haymitch watching Katniss grow was a pleasant surprise that I didn't expect, but I was happy that it was included, especially because we find out that Katniss reminds Haymitch of Luella, hence why he calls Katniss Sweetheart. I also liked how Burdock became a soft spot for Haymitch after all these years, and he was the reason he wrote in the memory book, which was a book that was of course mentioned in Mockingjay. It was nice to know that Haymitch was able to use the book to finally tell the story of everyone he lost. But the final words are what really got me, as two quotes connected to his and Lenore Dove's relationship come back around. "Nothing you can take from me was ever worth keeping, and I love you like all fire." These quotes were what kept Haymitch going, and we discover that Haymitch has always had her in his heart and mind, no matter how much pain he went through. As I said at the beginning of the video, overall, I enjoyed this book. I think it added a lot to a story that we already had some background on, but I do think picking this time period hurt both its intrigue and suspense. I could have done with less fan service, but some of the characters that were added were a lot of fun to read. I might have had a lot of complaints, but it's a review, so that's kind of the point. But overall, the good far outweighs the bad. I'm still making a bunch of videos on this book, including the updated life of Haymitch Abernathy. So stay tuned for that, hit the subscribe button and the bell to make sure you don't miss it. That's all for today though, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next Sunrise on the Reaping video.